I'm going to, of course, speak from a UNICEF perspective, which then cutting across more from a global perspective, but I do look forward to drilling down into the countries that we're particularly focused on as part of this conference. So and this has been much discussed in the earlier speakers and during the last 3 days, I know, but the impact of COVID-19 on education has indeed compounded the learning crisis. Unprecedented scale of school closures, 1.6 billion children at the height of the disruption. And of course, those of us working at the global level in education would have never thought those figures would even be possible. We continually are recognizing the most marginalized are being affected the most. There is a disproportional impact on children, and I'll talk more about that. And I am going to talk a little bit about the shock on education budgets, and we're talking about the triple shock, and that is the pressure, fiscal pressure government's under. We recognize the declines in household income, and we also recognize the pressure that those of us in the donor community, the humanitarian community, are going to be increasingly under. So just a little bit of data on one way to look at why learning is at risk and why the pandemic and the disruption caused by the pandemic has further exacerbated the learning crisis. One way to look at that is just purely the proportion of the days that have been affected as a proportion of the average school days. And there is a distinction between those countries that are following a September to June academic year and those are following a calendar year. But regardless, if you take a look at this table, you're into some very significant proportion of the school days that have been affected and potentially will be even more, continue to be affected depending on when schools reopen. Let me just, now there's a lot of data, a lot of quantitative data, a lot of qualitative data, a lot of human interest stories around the impact on the disruption on education, school closures on the most vulnerable and who the most vulnerable are. Of course, it depends very much on each context. This here is one way to look at it. One way to disaggregate who are the most vulnerable and how are they being impacted and who are therefore most at risk is by age. And we see pre-primary, primary, lower secondary, upper secondary, and tertiary being affected differently. We also see a gender difference between on average globally between girls and boys. We also see, and the data is not here presented here, but we also see a difference between, and amongst the most disadvantaged are those living in remote areas, those living in poor backgrounds, and those disabled and with specific learning profiles. I do want to throw out a number, which is it's estimated that 24 million children are at risk of never returning back to school when schools reopen globally. And again, these are incredible numbers. 24 million children globally are at risk of not returning back to school. So if you map that, currently we're still at about 875 million children. It's about half, actually. We're about halfway in terms of 1.6 billion at the peak of the disruption. Now we're about half of those children had returned. And this gives you a sense of which countries have partially opened, which countries have fully opened, and which countries are yet to open. And you can see there is a geographic element to this with, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but with the East opening more currently than Africa is beginning to reopen, and some have reopened, and Latin America and South America remains predominantly still closed. That somewhat mirrors the transmission of and those countries that are still experiencing high transmissions, but not directly correlating. What is interesting are some of the outliers. Like if you take a look in Africa, it is not a consistent view across the continent, and you see also actually all regions, there's not consistency. But I do want to emphasize this partially open, and we are running into new territory and risks of countries and governments that partially open, meaning either by age or certain number of days or certain parts of the curriculum, and then peaking at that partially opening, and that having also a very real impact on children. Something I'll talk more about. So if you now just by region, this is another way to look at it, but if you look at it's my far right, I guess it's everyone's far right, that's the world. That light blue is the fully opening by mid-October. So that's the percentage of countries that have announced either are open or have announced plans to reopen by middle of October. Then you still have a significant percentage, which is the purple at the bottom, which have yet to announce a reopening even by middle of October. Why this is very important too is, and we learned this from the school closures and the Ebola crisis in West Africa, but the impact, particularly on those vulnerable, correlates very clearly with the length of the closures. And as closures are prolonged, it has a disproportionately increased impact on the most vulnerable. So indeed, we are into a race, basically, reopening the schools while we still have a chance to bridge the most vulnerable children back. So I'm going to just, I'm not going to bore you too much with UNICEF talk here, but I'm going to just drill down a little bit into how we've responded. Being one of the largest education agencies globally, we mobilized all 145 country offices. We have about 800 education staff throughout the world, and we're going through these 4 stages, mirroring the 4 stages of countries. Before school closures, that's now back February, March, April, we were engaging with governments all over the world on how to keep schools open safely. Then during school closures, second phase, we spent a lot of time and resources, and still are in many countries, on remote learning. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I'm going to focus mostly on the third stage, which is school reopenings, which, as you can see now, we're into about half the children are coming back to school, are back to school, at least partially. And so we're very much engaging in the reopening process. And then some countries and some governments have moved to the recovery period in medium and long term. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that too. And I'm glad that the conversation at the conference also has been very much around how to seize this opportunity to change the way education, like in a sense, leapfrog the evolution of the education system. So let me drill into the reopening process, and I'll just take a few minutes on this. There were a couple of, and I do encourage governments and anyone working in education to look at these frameworks. These are UN-wide frameworks that provide a framework, provides a tool to plan, to decide when the reopening and to plan the reopening process. So some of the key messages of the reopening that we're communicating with governments, engaging with governments in all those 145 countries in lower and middle income countries are, we are calling for governments to prioritize the reopening of schools during the reopening of society process. So put schools in the first of the list when planning for and reopening societies, and take all possible measures to reopen safely. So one area that we do engage very intensely with governments on is if indeed a large swaths of the economies have opened, there's a lot of areas of the economy and societies have opened, and yet schools have remained closed. We feel that's not in the best interest of children. We do feel very strongly the importance of prioritizing reopening of schools to be amongst the first of those services to reopen. But then again, and I'll talk a little bit more, what possible measures can be taken to reopen them safely. Secondly, we need to recognize the devastating consequences, particularly on marginalized children, of prolonged school closures. And I know this has come up repeatedly in the conference, and I know all of us that work in education will very much recognize this, but we have to also see the impact of school closures on children, particularly the most marginalized, as broader than their impact on learning and learning outcomes. That is absolutely incredibly important. But we're looking at all the other services that schools provide. Of course, the most prominent is school meals, and something that we've written and engaged with governments a lot about. But we also have mental and mental health, psychosocial support, protection. We saw some very real impact of school closures on protection-related issues, particularly for adolescent girls in many countries during the Ebola crisis, but we're also seeing a lot of evidence, again, of protection-related issues for children also as a consequence of school closures. So the second message, the point here is let's recognize the impact of school closures in a comprehensive way. Third is we need urgent action, and this was very much discussed in the previous session, but to look at how do we not turn the global learning crisis into, and we're using catastrophe, and it looks data is indicating indeed there is reasons to use such dramatic terms. And then lastly, when governments do decide to keep schools closed, if at the moment societies have remained closed in certain countries and certain regions, it is critical that we scale up remote learning opportunities, including with quality, and a focus on that. And again, I'm happy to talk more about it if we'd like to in the discussion, but about remote learning. But one interesting statistic is that in the 145 countries in which we work, the average is 3.9 different remote learning modalities have been employed across the whole spectrum from low tech to high tech. So ranging from, in many countries, teachers delivering learning materials to homes, paper, pens, textbooks, etc., all the way up through the radio, television, and IT-enabled tools. So on average, 3.9 different modalities countries have used to encourage and enable remote learning. I do need to say, we issued a report last week that 473 million children in the world have not accessed any learning opportunities during this period. That's about a third of school-age children. So despite 3.9 different learning modalities, and despite all the efforts that have been taken by many organizations and governments, indeed, if you look at those children who either do not have access to any technology, or even as low tech as it may be, and or living in countries which have not employed remote learning through that modality, you're into 473 million children globally who have not been learning during their time of school closures. Now, let's talk a little bit around the reopening. This is far too much data, and of course the PowerPoint's been shared, and you can look at this, and there's lots more evidence coming more and more every day. But the good news is there's no correlation between the opening of schools and trends in cases of transmission. So the conclusion of that, of course, is it is indeed possible to reopen schools and not have an impact on transmission. And here are some case studies that are showing that. And again, many governments and many conversations I know many of us are in are increasingly showing that indeed schools can be reopened and not have an impact on transmission. Let me talk a little bit around the engagement around reopening. So there's very large-scale campaigns ongoing right now around when to reopen and how to reopen. The statistics on the top bar here gives a sense of the percentage of the countries in those regions that are engaging in the reopening process. So that, although I was saying there's still many governments that have yet to announce reopening, the good news is a lot are, if not the vast majority, engaging in these conversations. And the second line of the bar graphs are what are the key messages that governments are engaging in. So the key messages are the importance when planning reopening and implementing reopening to have a laser focus on the needs of the most vulnerable children. And that's a lesson from previous school closures of other humanitarian crises, albeit not at a global scale, but in many individual countries, but also in regions, that we need to have a laser focus on reopening schools that will reach in a way that will reach the most vulnerable children. That would mean have that door open as wide as possible and bridging the most vulnerable back and proactively enabling that, but also looking at the unique characteristics of those children in each context and reaching them proactively and overcome barriers to re-enrolling. There is also a certain percentage, of course, as you can see, much lower percentage that are engaging on the need for financing the reopening process and also continuing to protect public financing for education. There is now what the previous speaker also in that session was also talking about, how do we reopen in a way that will address the long-standing learning crisis so that we don't revert back to ways of teaching which were truly not performing resulting in the learning outcomes that we were aspiring for. And 88% of governments are indeed planning for and engaging with us and others around reopening in a way that will better serve children. So that's seizing the opportunity, if you'd like, of the disruption and the planning for reopening to much was discussed in the previous session, so that we don't revert to previous ways of teaching. So we're really encouraged by that figure of 88% of governments and education systems are at least engaging on the reopening process so that learning to improve in a way that can improve learning. Okay, now let me, and I hope I'm not sort of overwhelming with all the different stats, and you'll of course have this PowerPoint and can engage more, and there's many more sites and many more information sources. But let me just drill into this around the various elements of planning for the reopening around the world and the percentage of countries that are indeed taking action on the different key parts of reopening. So one is information. That's the first bar, which is providing very critical information, engaging with parents, engaging with teachers and school system around how to be safe, how to reopen safely, and engaging them in the reopening process. And you can see what percentage have taken little action in this regard. That's the red, which the yellow is which percentage have taken some, and the green is necessary actions, or our judgment on sufficient necessary actions. Ultimately, we would like to see across all of these bars all green. But you do get a sense, and some countries are indeed green across all, but you see a mixed bag. So the first is about the importance of engagement and providing critical information. The second is looking at schools as a platform for essential services, something I mentioned before, planning for school nutrition, planning for protection, planning for vaccinations. The third is mental health and psychosocial support services. The fourth is tailored outreach campaigns to reach disadvantaged vulnerable groups, including in most countries reaching girls and out of school. And fifthly, looking at reducing the barriers to enrollment. Now this is a very ambitious initiative here, but that is, can we seize the opportunity of reopening schools to even reach children that weren't enrolled prior? So while reopening, let's do a broad scale community mapping and even find 8-year-olds, 10-year-olds, 12-year-old children who have never been to school. And so that's a very exciting initiative taking place in many countries. Again, it's from this perspective that we talked about in the previous session, which is let's rethink what schools are, and let's rethink what services schools can provide, and maximize this opportunity of that rethinking process. So resilience is continuing to come up. It means a lot. That term means a lot. It means different things to different people. But one lesson, of course, is that those countries which had built more resilient education systems, I mean, to state the obvious, weathered this disruption more effectively. And one form of resilience is, again, the capacity to provide for children of all learning needs. And we do see children with disabilities as a particularly vulnerable group, both intellectual and physical. And you have some percentages here also that show which countries are proactively engaging by undertaking a vulnerability and calling it a reachability analysis. I know that's not I'm not even sure if that's English, but it's basically undertaking an analysis of how accessible and how reachable are schools and addressing the barriers that would inhibit returning to school. Now, this is too much information and even probably too small on your screen, but just to give a snapshot of examples all over the world of some amazing innovations and innovative approaches that governments are taking to reach the most vulnerable, to reopen schools in a different way, and so that, again, we leapfrog education years or potentially decades ahead. And so I would just encourage you to skim through that. I'm just sensitive to the time, so I'm going to move on. Okay, so what have we learned to date around the reopening process? And actually, tomorrow the UN, or 5 agencies, are issuing a paper on this, and I'll share it around to ARC so you'll have it. But it's a very short, snappy, because we're trying to engage with decision makers. What have we learned to date? And actually, just as a footnote, I am very, very encouraged by the amount of interaction taking place between governments, say, but within Africa, between African governments, between South American and Latin American and African and South Asian governments, exploring best practices and what have they learned while reopening. So here are 7. There has, and I mentioned before, there is no measurable impact of school reopening on community transmission, so that does not directly correlate. There's no correlation, although we do acknowledge there have been certain very localized, what we're calling cluster outbreaks in some context, and we're learning more about those. We work very closely with the World Health Organization on that. Being education people, of course, we rely on our doctors and health professionals to also help us understand how those cluster outbreaks work and how do we then prevent them. As I know, we all know, there is very limited, or in many countries actually no reported cases of child transmission associated with schools. We are learning a lot about the third message, which is the positive reinforcement of key risk mitigation interventions like hand washing. You know, hand washing is the kind of thing too, having lived in Africa, 3 postings with UNICEF for many years. These are these win-win behavior messages at schools that, of course, were critically important before the pandemic, now are even more so. So these are, when I say win-win, I mean it's a win for health and a win for behavior change for children to better wash hands and practice safe behaviors. It's a win for the school system also, and reducing the chances of transmission. 4th, flexible delivery approaches. And I mentioned this before, there's lots of examples of innovative ways of continuing to provide learning opportunities while reopening. Mentioned some of them here, some obvious ones like teaching outside, etc. But also a lot of interesting and innovative ways of shifting timing and leveraging technology, etc. Of course, very context specific, but the message being flexibility and innovative ways of continuing to reach children while reopening. Staging has been a very successful initiative in most countries. You can stage by geographic area, meaning open in certain parts of the country and not in others, while you learn protocols and engage with the population and build confidence. Staging also by age. And we've seen, interestingly enough, governments have prioritized younger kids, other governments have prioritized older children, and we engage, of course, in that process. And honestly, there may not be any right answer that means at the global level, this is exactly the right way to do it. It's a very context-specific exercise. The lesson we're learning is staging and sequencing is indeed very helpful. Engagement, and I keep talking about engagement. That is absolutely critical with children and youth themselves, with teachers, with parents, policymakers. Using evidence, engaging with what's working, using best practices, but a process of engagement is absolutely critical. And sufficient and flexible resources in the hands of the school at the school level has correlated directly with successful reopening. And so if we're ever to evaluate, going down to the school level and assessing the level of resources available is going to correlate with success of reopening. I'm wrapping up in a minute or two, and thanks. I know how intense it's been for everyone for the last 3 days, so I'm sure you're also happy to hear that. But I am just going to flag finances. This graph just is one way of looking at the potential impact of COVID-19 on education, public education resources globally. The yellow line at the top is a projected flow, availability of resources in 132 over 145 countries where we work, so low, middle income countries. And you'll see it was projected to be increasing. The gray, the next one down, is if the share of education, so if we were all collectively able to convince governments to increase their percentage of their budgets to education, recognizing how important education is as a response to COVID-19, but taking into consideration the projected contraction of the economy, then you look at the amount of money that is going to be dropping in education. So increasing education budgets, but decreasing GDP. Then the blue is keeping the share of education budget as it is, as a portion of government budgets, but looking at the projected decrease in GDP. And then potentially, and very worryingly, the most likely scenario is a reduction in education budget coupled with a reduction in size of the economy. And that's when you end up with the orange scenario. Now, why would government decrease the education budgets at this time despite our best efforts? And it's from a recognition of other fiscal demands, including reinvesting and reopening the economy, health expenditures, etc. So we may have, and I may have my blinders on education, but I'm very sensitive to the pressures that governments are under. But our message is, from a UNICEF education perspective, is be very careful not to compromise or have an impact on your medium and long-term potential of your societies, of your children, of your economies by decreasing education budgets to meet very short-term current pressure on government's budgets. Last, this is from the UN as a whole, the Secretary General. We were very much involved in this as UNICEF, but it came out as a UN document it's called the policy brief. I just would encourage you to skim through it. Here are the key recommendations, many of which I've covered, but it's another way of looking at, from a slightly broader perspective, UN-wide. But I maybe just want to flag the fourth bullet point, which is reimagine. And this is the type of terminology that we would encourage us to be using as an education community. Is let's reimagine education, recognizing it was overdue for reimagination, and let's seize this opportunity to indeed leapfrog into the future. Thanks again to the organizers. Thanks to our opportunity, and I look forward to the engaging with you further, either now and of course UNICEF in countries, but also myself here in headquarters. Look forward to also continue engagement over time.